Welcome back to Think BRICS. It's great to have Gustavo de Carvalho with us again today. Gustavo, a Brazilian expert in international relations, has been living and working in South Africa for years. He recently went to the 2025 BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro. We invited him back to share his unique insights from that event and also to highlight the important work he is doing with his colleagues at the South African Institute of International Affairs, in particular, their YouTube series World in Flux, which examines South Africa's evolving foreign policy. So, Gustavo, welcome to Think BRICS again.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation.
Thank you. So, let's start with the explanation about this World in Flux project. When and why did you decide to work on this idea? So why this name actually?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that. And it's been part of the conversations at the institute for a while that we need to find more accessible ways of sharing our research.
Mm.
We are often producing papers, we briefing policymakers, but to a large degree, and I think in the space where we are globally now, and this idea of the world in flux, a changing world, a global order that is very confusing at the moment, that perhaps we needed to communicate in ways that can better explain the position of countries like South Africa, what are some of the trade-offs, what are some of the challenges, and to bring a little bit of more nuance to the debate. I think part of the challenges that we have at this stage internationally is that we often tend to see the world in binaries. It's either this or either that, and life is much more complicated than that. So the idea of the world in flux is something that is shifty, that is changing, and perhaps to add to discussions that we find to be particularly important in the current moment that we live.
I think it is a brilliant idea, and think Breaks we will be happy to share your content. Really, in your first episode, you put a focus on South Africa's active non-alignment strategy in foreign policy. This approach aims to keep South Africa independent, but there have been rising tensions with the United States. With all the new laws that could mess with South Africa's trade deals and partnerships, uh, how will this pressure affect South Africa's ability to stay neutral on the global stage?
I think it's an important question because perhaps for South Africa is beyond the idea of neutrality. I think neutrality is a legal idea. It's idea of equidistance, that there is a uh, we're right in the middle between different powers. And I think the idea that perhaps South Africa has been struggling for some time to explain it and to present what it is, but it talks about the idea of autonomy and how do we find spaces and avenues to craft relations globally in a way that is not entirely dependent on different geopolitical competitions that exist. Of course, that is not an easy feature for any country to do, and we've seen this year with very tense relations between South Africa and the United States, perhaps not so much in the as complicated perhaps as they were in the beginning of the year, with the number of very strange executive orders coming from the United States, with the false claims about a white genocide in South Africa, the tariffs, and so on. What we do find at this stage, and especially when it comes to the United States, is that first, the US still has a lot of leverage. The US is the largest economy in the world, it has a lot of reach, and countries do find importance to maintain that relationship with the US. But how to find specific compromises that are acceptable to South Africa, finding that soft balance, I think, in the US now is a little bit of difficult to gauge, but at the same time, diversifying the relations and finding new markets and new partners. In that sense, we've seen South Africa really put in a lot of effort this year in terms of identifying new spaces to engage with. I would say in South America, in Southeast Asia, and particularly in Africa, that has a lot of potential for the country in terms of exporting much of its processed goods, to create more integration of supply chains, and largely to find avenues that if we do lose more of the US markets, an important market for South Africa, the second largest trading partner for that the country in the short, medium, and long term becomes less affected by a lot of that tension. So I think the idea of non alignment in that sense remains somehow important because it is part of that ability of seeing the world beyond binaries, seeing the world from the positionality of South Africa, not necessarily from the positionality of global competitions between the US, China, Russia, Europe, and so on, but rather that those calculations are done slightly different than what we would, whether we were neutral. That means that we're somehow distancing and depoliticizing the space for South Africa, but neither one that we are just simply hedging the system.
Thank you. Uh, let's continue with BRICS. At the 2025 BRICS summit in Rio, South Africa said it would it would want to be less dependent on Western economies by creating new financial and trade partnerships within BRICS. This fits with its wider plan to diversify its trade, investment, attract investment, and to promote regional integration. Can you tell me a little bit more about what South Africa's role in BRICS today? And how will this help the country handle risks like losing access to major Western markets?
Absolutely. I think it's a critical question when we're thinking how a lot of the world is thinking at the moment. I think there's the idea that countries are looking to de-dollarize simply as a process of countering the United States. I think it's a problematic view. I don't think there is actively really a process of de-dollarization. There is a process of diversification of risks. If we look into the reason why countries utilize the US dollar, there is an obvious reason. It's easy to trade, it's fast, it's cheap, but increasingly is seen that some of the risks that are inherent from the US dollar are too high to be overlooked. So BRICS largely, and it's a process that has started already for 6 or 7 years, perhaps even more, have been discussing of there will be specific situations that countries like South Africa may find particularly interesting to settle trade with the South African rand. There may be instances where India may want to trade using the Indian rupee, or the Brazilian reais, or China with the renminbi, or Russia with the rubles. In that situation, it provides complementary tools, and these are the discussions ongoing within BRICS at the moment, that in the midterm, probably not something that we're going to see present within the financial discussions as existing tools in the next few years, but because there is a lot that needs to be done. For South Africa, and I think for most of BRICS members, the big question is what type of mechanisms do we need to create this international payment settlement platform? We often call it BRICS Pay, and then other accessory mechanisms like BRICS Bridge that would enable that. But there's still a lot of questions to be done, and this is a lot of what ministers of finance and governors of central bank of BRICS are discussing at the moment. How do we do that? BRICS countries, we tend, despite a lot of the commonalities and complementarity, we don't trade a lot with one another. We all trade a lot with China, but we don't have big trade between one another. So we need to find new ways and mechanisms that doesn't create imbalances for its members and make this process to fail from the start. Second, we need to find ways in which How are we going to settle that? What kind of exchange rates are we going to do? That seems an awfully technical thing to think, but it's especially important if we want those mechanisms to be sustainable. And finally, how do we integrate that within other mechanisms that already exist? If we're looking to the bilateral arrangements that countries like, for instance, Russia and China are doing now, settling trade either with renminbi or rubles, or when we're talking about India and the UAE that have bilateral arrangements, China and Brazil. In Africa, in particular, where I'm based, there's been a long discussion for many years now about the creation of the Pan African settlement and payment system. That particular system has a lot of potential and is also being under development, perhaps slightly more advanced than what we see within BRICS, but that provides that multiple integrations that is not just simply a way of cutting off the US dollar, but really to finding new ways. If we see the rise of gold this year, that has been seen as this reserve value, especially moment of crisis, now reaching over $4,000, that is a signifying that international and global markets are looking for new ways of reducing potential risks that exist at the moment with the lack of the confidence in terms of the international trade system. That it's perhaps for me less about creating alternatives, creating ways of getting out of the existing systems, but it provides us much more tools within the toolbox that will maintaining very specific and in large amounts of trade transactions using the US dollar, but in many other may make sense to use a pool of currencies. In some instances, may be interesting to use the euro. In some instances, may be interesting to use potentially in future the BRICS Pay or the Pan African payment system. That I think is what fosters the rise of new technologies, but also that provides multiple options that enables majority of the global population and countries to really benefit from international trade in a way that is more diversified and brings less risks.
Yeah, the aim is to build alternative mechanisms just to diversify trade. Yeah, you're right. Um,
Complementary,
yeah, complementary. Yep.
yeah.
South Africa has been really important in getting global South's voice heard at in the G20. And they have been also successful in campaigning for the South African Union to join as 21st member, 21st participant in G20. And this year, South Africa is chairing the G20. The recent P20 summit, for those who is not familiar, let me explain. P20 is the platform for the parliaments of the G20 countries to contribute to the debates on the global issues. So, the recent P20 summit focused on cooperation and development, avoiding divisive political issues. Can you explain why South Africa chose to steer clear of political controversies like Ukraine at the P20? How does this reflect its main goals for the upcoming G20 summit in Johannesburg?
I think it's an important question because it very much reflects the first point that we discussed earlier about how South Africa positions itself. I think the ability that South Africa brings within this process is, and how it sees itself within the world, is this often this role of a bridge that South Africa has multiple relations in different parts of the world. We've seen, for instance, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, South Africa really, especially since mid 2023, presenting itself as a bridge between the two players. President Ramaphosa went to Kiev and St. Petersburg in mid 2023, leading the African Peace Initiative. That really what it aimed to do is to say, listen, this is a regional conflict in Europe that has global implications, then and it affects us all. When South Africa then is chairing G20 in an important year, for the first time the G20 is hosted within the African continent. It is the second time the Africa Union is participating as a full member of the G20, expanding then African voices. In many of those spaces, it's important to bring the variety of voices because that idea of dialogue as fostering potential solutions of global issues, it is something that remains fundamentally important. Once again, we're not really talking here about neutrality in the sense of we have to avoid uh, uh, engaging in specific situations, but much rather that South Africa remains with very important and relevant bilateral relations with Russia, but it also has developed important bilateral relations with Ukraine as well. In that sense, it does provide a country that challenges in terms of what controversies it may create with partners like Russia for bringing Ukraine, or the controversy of not bringing Ukraine for Western partners for the country. I think it is a catch-22 often that it brings the country, but I think it's a quite a representative space for the country that continues to advance a lot of its positions and views and providing this kind of very diverse sets of relations that often is seen as a challenge because you have to be explaining that and you have to be interacting to showcase that this is what we really mean by those actions, but at the same time that it builds within that space the intended credibility of the country of presenting itself as a bridge.
Many saw this like a pullback. Maybe it's off topic for our conversation today, but you remember when South Africa stand to defend Gaza in the International Court of Justice, but this time they tried to pull back a little bit from that international agenda of the war, of the crisis, military clashes, and they decided to. And correct me if I'm wrong. It was explained like G20, it's a platform for cooperation, for mutual benefit, for economic integration, and not for political clashes discussion. Right? It was
Um,
explained like that.
if I could add to this, I think there is 2 points. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a pullback. I think first of all, the chair of G20 doesn't fully control the agenda. I think there is an important role of the chair in terms of bringing the issues. You're still negotiating with all of the other members in terms of what is included and who is included within that. I think the second issue that I think is particularly important is that when South Africa makes certain decisions and that it's able to do within its chairship of the G20, I think those it also does reflect in terms of how is South Africa seen within the different spaces, what it is relevant for the group and for South Africa and for the region in terms of doing that without and acknowledging that at times this may create for South Africa as a country, it is important to maintain the relationship it has with Russia, but it has also been important for a number of years to maintain that relation with Ukraine, not necessarily to state that one side is correct and the other one is not. I think South Africa, when it presents itself as a bridge, as a mediator, as one that fosters dialogue, is that it does want to create those spaces for discussions, even if it takes time for a solution to be found.
Trying to not to choose sides.
Yeah.
Well, let's come back to the and talk about BRICS, and this will be the topic of the second episode of your series. You have seen how BRICS countries have worked together through the G20 to create a more balanced global order and focus development instead of political conflicts. How important is it for BRICS to keep this unity in forums like G20? What are some of the main challenges for South Africa faces in keeping the ground united and influential?
Yeah, I think this is perhaps the most fundamental question within BRICS at the moment. Because since the expansion, I think there has been quite clear that the expansion brought a lot of benefits for the group. There is stronger representation, there's new voices, there's new ideas, but it also makes consensus building a much more challenging process for BRICS itself. In the sense of BRICS historically has seen consensus both as a mechanisms for finding decisions, but also a value. It is a value on how we moderate positions that are often different from one another. They're not necessarily clashing all of the times, but they're very nuanced in that sense. So for you to achieve consensus within BRICS and for you to make decisions, I usually say there's three things you can do. BRICS can either take an issue entirely out of the agenda and in a way say we're not the best positioned group to deal with that. BRICS can often dilute language, and what does it mean? Often we see some discussions that are fairly vague in the decision making, and that is often quite deliberate because it's something that is still being negotiated and may take times for the members to actually find that consensus. And then you keep that issue in the agenda and incrementally start finding a way around it. And the third way is that you heavily negotiate on something for this. What we saw in the last few years is there is a new identity of the group, and rightfully so. When we double the number of members, we certainly start seeing new issues on the table, issues that perhaps were not contentious before that become contentious now. We've seen a lot of debates, for instance, this year in Brazil around Security Council reform, and a lot of debates, particularly on the language that BRICS would bring in terms of its own endorsement of the possibility of the Security Council being reformed, and especially around the African representation around that. What it was fascinating to me to see was that while in April this year, we were not able to have a declaration of the foreign ministers of BRICS in Brasilia, precisely because of this matter. That in itself, at that time, many of us saw like, oh, this is a big failure for us. But what it led was a continuous process of negotiation that led to a very interesting language within the Rio Declaration in July around Security Council reform. There really was a workaround on these issues. So the big questions for countries like South Africa and for all of the other members at this stage, for me, it is the question on how do we enhance our process of achieving consensus within the group? How do we create this issue of that we often call as institutionalization? It's not necessarily a formalization of the group. I think the membership believes that the informal nature of the group is part of its strength, but it's how do we make it more predictable? How do we make it more sustainable? How do we better incorporate our new members that, despite being very active in the discussions, are still trying to find a ground in terms of where they stand and how they can utilize? We have over 180 working groups and mechanisms of cooperations within BRICS. It's a lot. A lot of them are really active and have tangible outcomes if we're looking to the negotiations and discussions on agriculture, even on tourism. But we have a lot of groups that either overlap one another or with very few things to show in terms of progress. So that fine tuning is not really a reform process that is expected within BRICS at the moment, but it's really a fine tuning around what is our new identity as a much larger group. How do we balance different expectations from its members, where we see some members really looking for a very expensive agenda and other members looking for a slightly more narrow agenda? The key there is that neither of those views usually is what succeed within BRICS. It's that minimum common denominator that keeps shifting how minimal that is really the trick that BRICS has been developing over the years, and right now becomes particularly imperative in this new situation that is relevant for South Africa, for the three African members of BRICS. It was relevant for Brazil during the presidency this year of BRICS, and I believe will be particularly relevant in 2026 for India when they take over the presidency from Brazil.
Thank you. If we take the experience of G20, that 20 nations plus 21st member as the African Union, and from the other side, we take BRICS with 10 core members and plus 10 member countries. So we have almost the same structure. Maybe the experience of G20 will help
Yeah.
BRICS countries to develop the relationship inside the group. Because if we take, I don't know, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, China are both in G20 and both in BRICS. So maybe it will help. Um, let's continue with another question about South Africa. South Africa wants to use its resources and manufacturing skills to create local jobs and support economic growth as part of its foreign policy goals. The country uses regional and global platforms like we already mentioned BRICS and G20 and African continental free trade area for this. How well can South Africa use these platforms to meet its goals of making the most of its resources and creating jobs while also dealing with pressure from the world's largest power?
I think it's probably, if you were to ask this question to President Ramaphosa, I think he would probably say that this is the key thing that South Africa needs to think about and advance. Because if we look into where is South Africa in the world at the moment, both in terms of its own political stances, but I think particularly when we see its own presence within global supply chains, South Africa has quite a diversified range of partners. South Africa trades a lot with China, South Africa trades a lot with India, South Africa trades a lot with the US, and South Africa trades a lot with Europe. But particularly, South Africa trades a lot with Africa. South Africa, if we are to think of Africa as one entity, it's a problematic statement, but it's just for the sake of analysis. If we look into the 54 African member states of the United Nations as one entity, South Africa would be the fourth largest trading partner of the continent. It trades almost as much as the United States does with Africa. It trades more than France. It trades more than the UK. It trades more than a lot of Western countries that have historical relations with that. So when South Africa talks about the strengthening and implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, when South Africa talks about the increasing complementarity between African economies, when South Africa talks and pressures for increased added value of the products that are being produced and exported by the continent. This is not just an ideological expectations in terms of Pan-Africanism and in terms of unity within the continent. This is also, they can be both. This is also a self-serving interest that South Africa perceives that if the continent grows more, if we start trading more with one another, if we build better infrastructure that better connects the continent, if we find better mechanisms that makes trade within Africa cheaper, faster, and with less layers and bureaucratic processes, that in itself creates an incentive for what is one of the largest trading markets for South Africa to diversify its presence, to increase their cooperation with other countries. And that's where initiatives like BRICS, the presence within the G20, its participation in the Africa Union, efforts within the United Nations, all of those are complementary, because if there is one thing we start seeing more and more a common voice within the continent, It is the fact that we need to create jobs, increase economic opportunities, not simply as a means of gaining revenues and capitals and making the economies grow in an abstract manner, is because that is seen as the most sustainable way for many countries to find the revenues and to build the skills and to create the jobs that lead to sustainable development. That, I think, is an important shift on how not only South Africa but Africa as a whole starts looking into the very concept of development. If we looked into the General Assembly speeches of African countries in recent years, there's been an important shift where for many years the big focus on development were about the official development assistance or grants and aid that is being provided to many of these countries. The conversation now within the continent, it is about investments. It is about ensuring there is a less costly way that African countries and South Africa can access international markets. It doesn't make much sense to me that some of the least developed economies in the world have a much higher cost for borrowing money in the open markets than what developed economies do. Yes, I understand the issues of risks and so on, but in a way, we need to that idea of the cost of the money. The cost of money in Africa seems to be much higher than the cost of money in other parts of the world, and that is increasingly seen as one of the, not perhaps not the only one, but one of the most important mechanisms to ensure development, sustainable growth, and job creation within the continent that places the African continent in a much more favorable position within the global markets.
Gustavo, thank you very much for your point. Really, I hope the leaders will follow your thought.
I hope so too.
Well, before we wrap up, could you please tell our audience where and how they can watch the World in Flux series?
So thank you once again for this. And we have launched last week the first episode of Saya's World in Flux. You can find it on Saya's YouTube channel, and it is very prominently present there. You can also look into our social media and Saya's website. And just as a brief announcement that we are expecting to publish the second video of the season, as you mentioned, focusing on BRICS by the end of October this year. And we will continue launching some episodes every month coming forward.
Well, we are looking forward to see it really. To our viewers, don't forget to subscribe not only to the South African Institute of International Affairs and their YouTube channel too, but also to Think BRICS so you won't miss our exclusive interviews and updates. Gustavo, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for being with us today for this conversation. I hope our viewers will appreciate that the same as I do. And we are waiting for you to come to Think BRICS one more time. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for watching.